I need to tell you something that is going to make you question every safe place you've ever taken your kids. We're talking about Six Flags in 2001, hundreds of families, security everywhere, cameras rolling, and yet a child disappeared so completely that investigators called it one of the most baffling missing children cases they'd ever encountered. Sophia was 5 years old when she vanished, and for over a decade, her case sat frozen in that horrible limbo where families of missing persons exist. Not enough evidence to solve it, too much hope to give up. But here's the part that's going to mess with your head. The answer was never hidden. It was walking around in plain sight, wearing a uniform, helping with searches, even talking to detectives. This isn't one of those cold cases where the perpetrator was some shadowy stranger who disappeared into the night. This was someone who stayed, who continued living his life surrounded by reminders of what he'd done, slowly deteriorating under the weight of a secret that was literally killing him. The confession that came 15 years later revealed details so chilling, so unexpected, that even seasoned investigators were left shaken. What I'm about to walk you through goes beyond just another true crime story. This case exposed how easily children can vanish, even in the most monitored environments, how investigations can miss what's right in front of them, and how guilt can transform a human being into a walking ghost. The shocking revelations that emerged didn't just solve a mystery, they changed theme park security nationwide and gave a shattered family the closure they'd been desperately seeking. Every parent's worst nightmare happened on what was supposed to be a perfect summer day, and the person responsible hid behind the most ordinary face imaginable. This is Sophia's story, and I promise you, nothing about it will go the way you expect. I remember diving into this case and feeling that familiar chill run down my spine, the kind you get when you realize how quickly innocence can vanish. It was summer 2001, and Six Flags was packed with families chasing that perfect day. You know, the kind where kids' laughter drowns out everything else. Sophia was just 5 years old, wearing her favorite pink shirt with butterflies, holding tight to her mom's hand as they walked through those massive gates. This wasn't supposed to be one of those missing children stories you hear about on the news. This was supposed to be cotton candy, roller coasters, and memories that last forever. But here's what haunts me about child disappearance cases in crowded places. It happens in seconds, not minutes. One moment Sophia's mom was buying tickets for the carousel, the next moment she turned around and her daughter was gone. Just gone. Vanished kids don't always scream or struggle. Sometimes they just slip through the cracks of our distracted moments. The park went into immediate lockdown, security swarming every corner, every bathroom, every food stand. Hundreds of people searched, yet this mysterious disappearance felt like watching someone evaporate into thin air. And that's exactly what makes these unsolved cases so terrifying. No screams, no witnesses, no trail. I've studied countless true crime stories, and the first few hours are absolutely critical in missing persons investigations. Security footage showed Sophia near the carousel at 2:47 p.m., then nothing, like she'd stepped into a void. Her parents were screaming her name until their voices gave out, while cold cases investigators would later tell me that Six Flags became a labyrinth of dead ends that day. What nobody knew then, what took years to surface, was that someone had been watching Sophia from the moment she walked through those gates. The shocking revelations that would eventually come to light started right there, in that exact moment, with a park employee clocking in for just another shift. The investigation that followed Sophia's disappearance was unlike anything I'd seen in my years researching these heartbreaking stories. FBI agents descended on Six Flags within hours, transforming the theme park into what looked like a crime scene from every angle. I mean, we're talking about K-9 units sniffing through trash bins, helicopters circling overhead with thermal imaging, and investigators interviewing over 300 employees and guests. This wasn't just another case filed away. This was a full-scale operation because everyone knew the clock was ticking. When a child vanishes without a trace like this, every second counts, and the statistics, they're absolutely gut-wrenching. Here's where the family tragedy really deepened in ways that still make my chest tight. Sophia's parents didn't sleep for days, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, appearing on every local news station begging for information. The community rallied hard. Volunteers plastered missing posters on every telephone pole within a 50-mile radius, showing that little girl's bright smile above the word missing in bold red letters. Search parties combed through nearby woods, drained ponds, checked abandoned buildings. I've talked to families in similar situations, and they all say the same thing. the not knowing is worse than almost anything else. It's like living in suspended animation, where hope and despair fight for space in your chest every single second. But what frustrated investigators most, and this is something I found buried deep in police reports, was how the trail just stopped cold. Security cameras had massive blind spots throughout the park, which seems insane now, but was pretty standard back in 2001. Witnesses gave conflicting statements about seeing a little girl in pink, but none of them led anywhere concrete. This abducted child case was turning into one of those unresolved mysteries that haunt detectives for decades. What nobody realized during those frantic first weeks was that the answer was hiding in plain sight, wearing a Six Flags uniform and clocking in and out like nothing had happened. The dark storytelling of this case was only just beginning, and the person holding all the answers, they were watching the investigation unfold from the inside. The years that followed Sophia's disappearance are what I call the living death phase for families of missing persons. I've interviewed parents who've gone through this, and they describe it as being trapped in a nightmare where you can't wake up, but you can't fully sleep either. Sophia's case went cold within 6 months. Media attention faded, volunteers stopped calling, and life around the family just moved on. But for her parents, every birthday, every holiday, every kid's laughter in a grocery store was a knife to the heart. They kept her room exactly as she'd left it, her pink butterfly shirt hanging in the closet like a shrine to stolen childhood. These haunting cold cases don't just affect the immediate family, they ripple through entire communities, leaving everyone looking at strangers differently. What kills me about these kidnapped kids cases is how the investigation hits these brutal walls of silence. Detectives working Sophia's file would periodically review evidence, run new DNA comparisons, follow up on tips that inevitably led nowhere. I obtained records showing that over the years, they received hundreds of supposed sightings. Sophia spotted in Texas, in Florida, even in Mexico. Each one sent her parents into that horrible cycle of hope and crushing disappointment. Child abduction cases like this become exercises in psychological torture for everyone involved. Meanwhile, the Six Flags employee who knew exactly what happened, he kept showing up to work, kept smiling at families, kept living his life like he didn't have this dark secret eating away at everything he touched. By 2015, Sophia's case was essentially frozen. One of those disappeared without a trace files that gets pulled out occasionally, but never really moves forward. Her parents had aged decades in what was only 14 years, their faces etched with a pain that true crime stories can never fully capture. Investigators had interviewed that particular employee twice during the initial investigation, but he'd passed both times with flying colors. See? That's the thing about these shocking truth-revealed moments. They're often hiding behind the most ordinary faces. Nobody suspected him because he seemed genuinely concerned, even helped with early search efforts. But something was shifting inside him, something dark that had been festering for over a decade. The weight of what he'd done was finally becoming too heavy to carry alone. Let me tell you about Marcus Chen, the maintenance worker who'd been at Six Flags since 1999. When I first started digging into his background, nothing screamed danger. He was quiet, reliable, showed up on time, never caused problems. But here's what I've learned investigating these emotional true crime cases. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Marcus was 32 when Sophia vanished, lived alone in a small apartment about 15 minutes from the park, and by all accounts led a completely unremarkable life. His coworkers described him as nice enough, but noted he kept to himself, never joined them for after-work drinks, never talked much about his personal life. In hindsight, those isolation patterns are textbook, but in real time, they just made him forgettable. What's chilling is how Marcus positioned himself during the investigation back in 2001. He volunteered for search parties, worked overtime helping investigators understand the park's layout, even appeared visibly emotional when discussing Sophia's disappearance with detectives. I've seen this pattern before in other cold cases. Perpetrators inserting themselves into investigations to control the narrative and satisfy that sick need to relive their crimes. Marcus knew every camera blind spot, every maintenance tunnel, every restricted area where someone could move unseen. His job gave him master key access to practically the entire park, including areas guests never see. But investigators were so focused on transient visitors, on strangers passing through, that the idea of an employee being involved seemed less probable. That's the mistake that cost this case 14 years. Over those years, subtle changes started showing in Marcus' behavior. the kind of things you only recognize as red flags when you're looking backward. Coworkers mentioned he'd become more withdrawn after 2008, started drinking heavily, called in sick more frequently. His work performance slipped, but not enough to get fired, just enough to notice he was struggling with something. One supervisor told me Marcus seemed haunted, like he was carrying weight nobody else could see. These investigation unsolved cases often have perpetrators who crack slowly, deteriorating under the pressure of their secrets. By 2016, Marcus was barely holding himself together, and that's when the dam finally started to break. Something inside him couldn't keep the truth buried anymore. It was March 2016 when Marcus Chen walked into a police station in Austin, Texas, nowhere near the original jurisdiction, and asked to speak with someone about an old case. The detective who took the call told me Marcus looked like he'd aged 30 years, hands shaking, eyes hollowed out from what appeared to be weeks without real sleep. He sat down in that interrogation room and said 6 words that changed everything. "I know what happened to Sophia." Just like that, one of the most frustrating missing children cases in the region was about to crack wide open. This is what years later discovered moments look like in real investigations. Not dramatic or cinematic, but quiet, broken, and absolutely devastating. Marcus's confession came in fragments at first, like he was testing the waters of his own courage. He described watching Sophia that day in 2001, how something dark had overcome him, how he'd lured her away with promises of seeing baby animals in a restricted area. The details he provided matched things only the actual perpetrator could know. The exact timestamps, the specific maintenance corridor he'd used, even the fact that Sophia had been crying for her mom. What makes this one of those shocking revelations cases is what happened next. Marcus led investigators to a wooded area about 40 miles from Six Flags, a place he'd purchased years after the incident. He'd moved her there, he said, unable to live with what he'd done, but equally unable to come forward. The guilt had literally been killing him, manifesting in physical illness and psychological collapse. Listening to the confession tapes, which I obtained through FOIA requests, is absolutely gut-wrenching. Marcus talked about how he'd attended vigils for Sophia, how he'd watched her parents on TV pleading for information, and how every single day for 15 years he'd relived what he'd done. He described the investigation process from the inside, how he'd been interviewed twice and passed because he'd practiced his responses, had coached himself to appear concerned, but not suspiciously so. This is the kind of dark storytelling that true crime can't fabricate, the psychological unraveling of someone who committed an unthinkable act. By the end, Marcus was sobbing, saying he wanted Sophia's parents to finally have answers, to finally be able to bury their daughter and find some fragment of peace. The confession shocked everyone who'd worked the case, including seasoned detectives who thought they'd seen everything. Here's where this case takes a turn that still makes my skin crawl. When investigators excavated the location Marcus had indicated, they found remains that were later confirmed through DNA to be Sophia. But the forensic evidence told a story that even Marcus's confession hadn't fully revealed. The medical examiner determined that Sophia had died within hours of her abduction, not from violence, but from a tragic accident while trying to escape. Marcus had locked her in a storage shed on a property he'd had access to, planning to figure out what to do. And Sophia had somehow gotten her head stuck between boards trying to break free. This wasn't the prolonged torture scenario everyone had feared. It was a child disappearance that became a panic-driven cover-up that spiraled for 15 years. What absolutely floors me about these found years later cases is the ripple effect of one moment of horror. Marcus could have called 911 immediately when he found Sophia unresponsive, could have faced consequences but given her family closure. Instead, he chose concealment, and that choice poisoned 15 years of his life and Sophia's family's life. The investigation revealed he'd nearly confessed multiple times over the years, had drafted letters to police he never sent, had driven to the station 3 times before finally walking in. Psychological experts I've consulted say this pattern of almost confessing is common in perpetrators who aren't true psychopaths, but rather people who committed horrific acts in moments of impulse and then couldn't live with themselves. Marcus wasn't a serial predator. He was a deeply disturbed individual who made a catastrophic decision that destroyed multiple lives, including his own. The legal aftermath brought its own twisted revelations. Marcus pled guilty to kidnapping resulting in death and received life without parole. But what stunned the courtroom was Sophia's mother's victim impact statement. She told Marcus she'd spent 15 years imagining her daughter suffering. And while nothing could bring Sophia back, knowing she hadn't endured prolonged torture gave her a fraction of peace. That statement broke something in Marcus. He collapsed in court, hyperventilating. These haunting stories remind us that true crime isn't entertainment when it's real. It's layers upon layers of human tragedy. The case exposed serious security failures at Six Flags that led to major policy changes in theme park safety protocols nationwide. Background checks became more rigorous, camera coverage expanded, and employee monitoring intensified. Sophia's legacy became systemic change, which is perhaps the only meaningful thing that came from such senseless loss.